Case 1. Henry Johnson Blair, a former federal customs agent, a 21-year phone call campaign, and a missing teenager who was never found. This is the case of Amy Bilig. On the 5th of March 1974, a 17-year-old girl walked out of her family's home in Coconut Grove, Miami-Dade County, and never came back. Amy Bilig had returned home that afternoon for lunch. She called her father, Ned Bilig, at his art gallery on Commodore Plaza to ask for money. Then she set out on foot, planning to walk or hitchhike roughly 1 mile down Main Highway to meet him. Hitchhiking was common in the close-knit, artistic community of Coconut Grove at the time, and Amy had done it many times before without incident. She never arrived. When Amy failed to return that evening, her mother, Susan Bilig, began making calls. By 6 o'clock the following morning, investigators had ruled out the possibility that Amy had simply run away. She had left behind money, personal items, and had given no indication she intended to leave home. Detectives shifted their theory from voluntary disappearance to suspected abduction. Miami-Dade police opened a formal investigation. Detective Andy Arostegui would go on to work the case for years, one of several investigators who remained assigned to it long after most missing persons files are closed. Early leads pointed toward motorcycle groups known to be passing through the Miami area on the day Amy vanished. Witnesses in the area reported seeing groups of bikers near Main Highway that afternoon, though no direct forensic link was ever established between any rider and Amy's disappearance. For Susan Bilig, the case would not end with the initial investigation. She began a personal search that would last the rest of her life, distributing flyers, following leads across the country, and refusing to let the case fade from public attention. Her persistence is part of why the case remains documented in such detail more than 5 decades later. The investigation took an unexpected turn 21 years after Amy disappeared. Beginning shortly after her disappearance, Susan Bilig began receiving anonymous phone calls from a man claiming to be holding Amy captive. These calls continued, on and off, for more than 2 decades. In October of 1995, the Federal Bureau of Investigation successfully traced one of these calls to a man named Henry Johnson Blair. Blair was a former United States customs agent who had briefly assisted with the original 1974 investigation into Amy's disappearance. Investigators found that his connection to the case gave him access to details that allowed him to make his calls to Susan Bilig appear credible. In 1996, Blair was convicted on charges related to stalking and harassment. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. In a related civil proceeding, the Bilig family was awarded a judgment of $5 million against him. Blair admitted to making the harassing phone calls but denied any knowledge of what actually happened to Amy. He was never charged in connection with her disappearance itself, and no evidence has ever placed him at the scene in 1974. Under Florida law, and under basic principles of due process, Blair is presumed not responsible for Amy's disappearance unless proven otherwise in a court of law. He remains, in the language used by investigators, a person of continued interest in the 21-year campaign of harassment, separate from the original disappearance. A separate development emerged in 1997, when a man named Paul Branch reportedly made a deathbed statement connected to the case. Investigators who reviewed the claim found it lacked credibility. Reports at the time indicated that Branch's widow had been paid for the story, which further undermined its reliability. Law enforcement did not pursue the claim as an active lead. Over the decades, investigators have compared unidentified remains found throughout Florida and neighboring states against Amy's dental and physical records. She has been excluded as a match in more than 150 cases involving unidentified remains recovered by authorities. This process, still ongoing, illustrates one of the most basic but essential tools in unsolved missing persons work: the continuous cross-referencing of unidentified remains databases against long-term missing persons files. Amy Bilig's case remains open today with Miami-Dade authorities. She has never been found, alive or deceased. Her file remains active in national databases used to compare unidentified remains against historical missing persons records, including systems maintained by the National Crime Information Center. The case has been documented extensively in print, including reporting by Miami Herald journalist Edna Buchanan, and in a book co-written by Susan Bilig herself. it remains one of the longest-running unsolved missing persons investigations in Florida history, spanning 5 decades of searching, forensic comparison, and public appeals for information. If anyone has information related to the disappearance of Amy Bilig, Miami-Dade police continue to accept tips through official channels. As with all cases in this series, no individual named in connection with any investigation has been convicted of wrongdoing related to a disappearance unless a conviction is specifically stated. The presumption of innocence applies fully and equally to every person referenced. This is the story of Amy Bilig, a case that has spanned 5 decades, 3 generations of investigators, and a mother's search that never stopped, even after her own passing. Before we move to Case 2, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Case Diaries. Every subscription helps keep these cases in front of the people who might one day hold the missing piece of information that finally closes a file. Case 2, Paul Eugene Rolls. A journal entry found after a man's death. 2 words, 1 date. And a case that had waited 25 years for an answer. This is the disappearance of Tiffany Sessions. On the 9th of February 1989, a 20-year-old University of Florida student told her roommate she was going for an evening walk along Williston Road in Gainesville, Alachua County. She left behind her identification, her wallet, and her car. Tiffany Sessions never returned. When she failed to come back, her roommate contacted Tiffany's mother, and within hours, one of the largest search efforts in the state's history had been launched. Tiffany's father, prominent South Florida developer Patrick Sessions, used his connections to bring public attention to the case, enlisting the help of professional athletes and public figures, including Miami Dolphins quarterback Dan Marino and future Florida Governor Jeb Bush, to help spread awareness. The Alachua County Sheriff's Office assigned Detective Jim Eckert to lead the original investigation. Eckert would later describe the case as one in which a young woman appeared to have vanished without any physical trace. Investigators canvassed the area along Williston Road, interviewed residents, and searched surrounding properties, but found no immediate evidence explaining what had happened to her. For years, the case remained officially unsolved, with no named suspect. Cold case detective Kevin Allen was assigned to revisit the file, cross-referencing it against other unsolved cases from the same era and region. The investigation reached a turning point in 2014, 25 years after Tiffany disappeared. Sheriff Sadie Darnell held a press conference identifying a deceased individual, Paul Eugene Rolls, as the case's prime suspect. Sheriff Darnell described the connection as, in her words, highly probable, based on physical evidence recovered after Rolls' death in 2013. Among Rolls' belongings, investigators found a personal journal and a 2002 calendar. Detective Kevin Allen described finding a specific notation in the material, the date February 9, 1989, followed by the notation number 2. Investigators interpreted this as a personal record kept by Rolls, potentially indicating Tiffany was the second person connected to this pattern of notations. Modern DNA analysis had already linked Rolls to a separate 1992 case, the death of Santa Fe College student Elizabeth Foster, whose remains were recovered off Williston Road, in the same general area where search teams had focused efforts during the original investigation into Tiffany's disappearance. It is important to state clearly what the evidence does and does not establish. Sheriff Darnell was direct on this point. There is no direct DNA evidence connecting Rolls to Tiffany Sessions. The connection identified by investigators is based on circumstantial evidence, the journal notation, the calendar, and the geographic overlap with the confirmed Foster case. Rolls was never charged in connection with Tiffany's disappearance, and he died before any such charge could be filed or tested in court. Under the law, he cannot be presumed responsible without evidence meeting the legal standard required for conviction, and no such proceeding ever took place. Rolls' criminal history includes a 1972 conviction for a homicide in Miami and a 1994 sentencing of 19 years for a kidnapping and sexual battery case in Clearwater. This established pattern of prior convictions is part of why investigators considered him a credible suspect in additional unsolved cases from the same general period and region, a standard practice in cold case work known as pattern analysis. Tiffany Sessions has never been found. Her case remains classified as missing, with the presumed suspect identified by police having died in prison in 2013 without ever facing trial for her disappearance specifically. The case illustrates a method increasingly used in cold case investigations, examining the personal effects, journals, and records of deceased individuals with documented histories of violent crime in order to identify potential connections to unsolved cases from the same era. This approach, sometimes called retrospective suspect analysis, has become more common as departments revisit decades-old files with updated forensic and investigative techniques. Alachua County investigators continue to treat the file as open. Should any new forensic technique or evidence emerge, in particular any development in DNA analysis capable of connecting physical evidence to a specific individual, the case could be formally reclassified. This is the case of Tiffany Sessions, 25 years between disappearance and a named suspect, and, to this day, a young woman who has never been found. Case 3. The Eisenberg Investigation. Federal wiretaps. A dismissed indictment. $1,500,000, paid back by the government itself. This is one of the most legally significant missing persons cases in Florida history. The disappearance of Sabrina Eisenberg. On the 24th of November 1997, a 5-month-old infant disappeared from her family's home in Valrico, Hillsborough County. Sabrina Eisenberg's mother, Marlene Eisenberg, told investigators she had checked on Sabrina asleep in her crib around midnight. When the family woke around 6:30 that morning, Sabrina was gone. So was a handmade yellow blanket that had been in her crib. The garage door and an interior garage door were both found open. Marlene Eisenberg called 911 to report her daughter missing. What followed became one of the most closely examined missing persons investigations in the state's legal history. Not because of what happened to Sabrina, but because of how the case was investigated. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened parallel investigations. 16 days after Sabrina's disappearance, investigators obtained legal authorization to place listening devices inside the Eisenberg family home. Surveillance began on the 13th of December 1997 and would continue for 79 days, ultimately capturing approximately 2,600 separate conversations. Nearly 2 years later, on the 9th of September 1999, a federal grand jury returned a 7-count indictment against Steve and Marlene Eisenberg. It is essential to be precise about what this indictment alleged. The parents were charged with conspiracy and with making false statements to investigators. They were not charged with harming Sabrina. During legal proceedings, an assistant United States attorney stated to the court that the child was believed to be deceased. This was a statement made in the course of prosecution, not a proven fact, and it remains one of the most disputed elements of the entire case. The case took a significant legal turn when a federal magistrate reviewed the wiretap evidence. The magistrate found that the affidavits investigators used to obtain authorization for the surveillance contained false statements. Additionally, when the recordings themselves were reviewed, they were found to be largely inaudible and unable to support the claims investigators had made about their content. Based on these findings, the magistrate recommended the wiretap evidence be suppressed. Facing the loss of its central evidence, the government made the decision to dismiss the indictment entirely on the 22nd of February, 2001. The legal consequences extended further. In a subsequent appellate ruling, cited as United States v. Eisenberg, 358 Federal Reporter 3rd Series, 1327, decided by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in 2004, the court ordered the federal government to reimburse the Eisenberg family's legal defense costs. That reimbursement totaled approximately $1.5 million. Steve and Marlene Eisenberg have never been charged with harming their daughter. Under the law, they are presumed to have had no role in her disappearance, and no court has ever found otherwise. They have maintained their innocence publicly and through every stage of the legal process. Sabrina Eisenberg herself has never been found. She would be an adult today, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has continued to release updated age progression images in the years since her disappearance, most recently updated for the current calendar year. These images are created using forensic imaging techniques that estimate how a missing child's appearance would change over time, a method used broadly across long-term missing children cases nationwide. The case has been the subject of national television coverage, including segments on America's Most Wanted and CBS's 48 Hours, both of which examined the investigation's legal complications in addition to the underlying disappearance. The Eisenberg case remains significant in law enforcement training today, frequently cited as a cautionary example regarding the standards required for electronic surveillance authorization, and regarding the importance of the accuracy of information provided to courts when seeking search warrants of any kind. Hillsborough County's file on Sabrina Eisenberg remains open. Investigators continue to state that any new information regarding her whereabouts would be pursued. This is the case of Sabrina Eisenberg, a disappearance that led not to a conviction, but to one of the most consequential rulings on investigative procedure in the state's legal history, and a child who, nearly 3 decades later, has never been found. Case 4. Gloria Williams. A newborn taken from a hospital room, a woman living under a different name for 18 years, and a single DNA swab that ended it. This is the case of Kamaya Mobley, and unlike most of the cases in this series, this one has an ending. On the 10th of July 1998, an infant girl was born to 16-year-old Kamaya Mobley at University Medical Center in Jacksonville, Duval County, now known as UF Health Jacksonville. Approximately 8 hours after her birth, a woman posing as a nurse entered the maternity area, told staff the infant needed to be checked for a fever, and left the hospital carrying the newborn. The baby, Kamaya Mobley, was gone. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office launched an investigation immediately. Investigator Rodney McKean was assigned to the case in 1998 and would remain connected to it as lead cold case investigator for roughly 12 years, an extraordinary length of continuous assignment that reflected how seriously the department treated the file, even as leads dried up. For 18 years, the case produced no confirmed sighting, no forensic breakthrough, and no named suspect. The child taken from that hospital room was, unknown to investigators, being raised under the name Alexis Kelly Manigo in Walterboro, South Carolina, by a woman named Gloria Williams. The case was resolved not through a chance discovery, but through the standard tip reporting infrastructure used across the country for missing children cases. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received information from at least 2 separate sources, including a high school friend of the young woman known as Alexis, expressing concern about inconsistencies in her background. Investigators followed up on the tips. A cheek swab DNA sample was collected and analyzed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. On the 12th of January 2017, the analysis confirmed the young woman's identity as Kamaya Mobley. Jacksonville Sheriff Mike Williams announced the resolution of the case at a press conference on the 13th of January 2017, 18 years, 6 months, and 3 days after Kamaya was taken. Detective Glenn Warkentine traveled to South Carolina to bring Gloria Williams back to Jacksonville to face charges. The legal proceedings that followed are documented in the case of State of Florida versus Gloria B. Williams, filed in Duval County under case number 16-2017 CF00539A CF-SEX in the 4th Judicial Circuit. Williams was formally charged on the 1st of February 2017 with 2 counts: kidnapping, classified as a first-degree felony, and interference with custody. She entered a guilty plea on the 10th of February 2018. On the 8th of June 2018, Circuit Judge Marianne L. Daho sentenced Gloria Williams to 18 years in prison on the kidnapping count, with a concurrent 5-year sentence on the interference count. She received credit for 511 days already served. Assistant State Attorney Alan S. Mizrahi served as lead prosecutor. Williams was represented by defense attorneys Diana L. Johnson and Matthew Lafrano. Subsequent appeals and post-conviction motions filed by Williams have been denied by the courts. A separate civil matter followed as well. Kamaya's biological mother, Kamaya Mobley, filed suit against the hospital where her daughter was taken. The matter was settled for approximately $1.5 million, structured as monthly payments of roughly $3,644, continuing through July of 2020, totaling an estimated $875,000 over the life of the settlement. Kamaya Mobley was found alive and in good health at 18 years old. She has since spoken publicly about her experience, describing a complicated relationship with the woman who raised her under a false identity for nearly 2 decades. This case stands as one of the clearest documented examples of how modern tip reporting systems, combined with routine DNA analysis, can resolve even the longest-running infant abduction cases. It also illustrates the extraordinary length of dedicated investigative assignment, 12 years by a single lead detective, that some departments commit to unresolved cases involving children. This is the case of Kamaya Mobley, 18 years missing, and the only fully resolved, living victim case in today's collection. Case 5. The investigation into Jennifer Kesse. An abandoned car with no explanation, a blurry 3-second surveillance clip, and, after 19 years, a case Florida investigators say is finally moving again. This is the disappearance of Jennifer Kesse. On the 24th of January 2006, a 24-year-old finance manager failed to show up for work in Orlando, Orange County. Jennifer Kesse had last been in contact by phone around 10 o'clock the previous night, speaking with family members and her boyfriend, Rob Allen. When she did not arrive at her job at Central Florida Investments in Ocoee the next morning, her employer contacted her parents. Her parents drove to Orlando and reported her missing that evening, and the Orlando Police Department opened an investigation immediately. 2 days later, on the 26th of January, Jennifer's black Chevrolet Malibu was located roughly 1 mile from her condominium, abandoned in the parking lot of the Huntington on the Green apartment complex. Surveillance footage from the area became one of the most examined pieces of evidence in the case. The footage showed an individual, believed to be male and dressed in workman's clothing, parking Jennifer's car around midday on the 24th of January before walking away from the vehicle. The footage was partially obscured by a fence, and the recording system only captured images at 3-second intervals, making a clear identification of the individual impossible using that footage alone. The Orlando Police Department assigned Detective Trisha Sprague to the case, and the file was later logged with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a national database used to identify potential patterns across unsolved violent crimes in different jurisdictions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Tampa field office began assisting in the investigation shortly after Jennifer's disappearance. Investigators identified several persons of interest over the following years, primarily individuals who had performed maintenance or construction work in the area around Jennifer's condominium. One individual, referred to in reporting only by the nickname Chino, was interviewed by detectives in 2009. He submitted to a polygraph examination, passed it, and was not charged with any offense connected to the case. For more than a decade, the investigation remained with the Orlando Police Department, and progress slowed considerably. In 2018, the Kesse family filed a lawsuit against the department in an effort to obtain access to the full case file, citing concerns about how thoroughly certain leads had been pursued. In 2022, responsibility for the investigation transferred to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Cold Case Missing Persons Unit. Special Agent in charge Felipe Williams, along with Special Agents Spears and Minehair, were assigned to lead the renewed effort. According to a Florida Department of Law Enforcement announcement made on the 20th of May 2025, investigators had interviewed 45 individuals since assuming the case in 2022, and had identified several new persons of interest during that process. The most significant recent development came in October of 2025. Jennifer's father, Drew Kesse, announced publicly, through a social media post on the 21st of October and in an interview with a local news outlet, that investigators had directly told the family the case was no longer considered cold. According to Drew Kesse, investigators described the renewed effort as, in his words, fruitful work, with substantial work still ongoing. Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigators told the family that DNA had been identified on evidence that had not previously been tested using modern forensic methods, and that the list of persons of interest had been narrowed significantly, down to what investigators described as a few individuals. Jennifer Kesse has never been found. Her case remains listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System under case number MP1342, with an original agency case number of OR010100 and an FBI case number of 0632039. This case illustrates a pattern seen across many long-running missing persons files, the transfer of an investigation from a local department to a specialized state cold case unit, followed by the reapplication of modern forensic DNA techniques to evidence collected years or even decades earlier. This method has produced breakthroughs in numerous previously stalled cases across the country and appears to be actively developing in this case as well. Anyone with information related to Jennifer Kessie's disappearance is encouraged to contact the Florida Department of Law Enforcement directly. This is the case of Jennifer Kessie, 19 years without resolution, but according to her own family, a case that state investigators now describe as actively moving toward an answer. If you're finding value in these detailed, fact-based case reviews, take a moment now to subscribe to Hidden Case Diaries. These cases deserve accuracy, not sensationalism, and your subscription helps this channel keep telling them that way. Case 6, Melinda Duckett. A cut window screen. A mother who could not answer basic questions from a 911 dispatcher. And a case that ended with 2 people gone, not 1. This is the case of Trenton Duckett. Please note, this case involves a young child. In keeping with this channel's editorial standards, we will state only the confirmed facts of the investigation. We will not speculate about, describe, or dramatize what may have happened to him. On the 27th of August, 2006, a 2-year-old boy was reported missing from his mother's apartment on Griffin Road in Leesburg, Lake County. Trenton Duckett's mother, Melinda Duckett, told investigators she had put him to bed around 7 o'clock that evening. She said she had friends over to watch a movie and discovered around 9:20 that Trenton was gone from his bedroom. A friend at the apartment called 911 and handed the phone to Melinda. During that call, Melinda Duckett was unable to answer several basic questions posed by the dispatcher regarding the timeline of events. Investigators later noted this inconsistency as one of several factors that shaped the direction of the case. The Leesburg Police Department, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies, launched an extensive search. Major Steve Rockefeller served as a department spokesperson during the investigation. Investigators examined the bedroom window, which was found open with the screen cut. As the investigation progressed, detectives stated publicly that Melinda Duckett was the only suspect they were considering in connection with Trenton's disappearance. Investigators reported finding personal items, including photographs, sonogram images, birthday cards, and children's food and toys, discarded in the trash after Trenton was reported missing. Melinda Duckett declined to submit to a polygraph examination and did not pass a voice stress analysis administered by investigators. Detectives stated they had ruled out both a stranger abduction and a transfer of the child to a relative as explanations. It is important to note additional context available in the public record. Melinda Duckett was born in South Korea and was adopted as a child. Trenton's paternal grandfather, James Aaron Duckett, is a former law enforcement officer who has been sentenced to death in an unrelated Florida case. Neither of these facts is evidence of anything regarding Trenton's disappearance. They are part of the documented public record surrounding the family. 13 days after Trenton was reported missing, on the 8th of September 2006, Melinda Duckett died by suicide. Her death occurred on the same day that a recorded television interview conducted by CNN commentator Nancy Grace aired publicly. The interview has been widely described as confrontational, and Melinda Duckett's family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Grace and CNN, citing the manner of the interview as a contributing factor in her death. Because Melinda Duckett died before facing any formal charge, no court ever determined her level of involvement, if any, in Trenton's disappearance. Under the law, she is presumed to have had no criminal responsibility unless a court had found otherwise, and no such finding was ever made. Trenton Duckett has never been found. The Leesburg Police Department continues to list his case as open. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has released updated age progression images over the years to assist the ongoing search. This case is frequently referenced in discussions of 2 separate professional fields, missing persons investigation and media ethics. Investigators point to the discarded personal items and the failed voice stress analysis as standard investigative factors that shape the direction of a case. Media analysts, separately, point to the Nancy Grace interview as a case study in the pressures placed on individuals connected to high-profile missing persons cases, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Community members in Leesburg have continued to hold annual vigils for Trenton, keeping his case in public awareness nearly 2 decades later. This is the case of Trenton Duckett, a child who has never been found, and a case that remains open to this day with Lake County investigators. Case 7. Michael Lee King. A cell phone stolen mid-abduction, a frantic call to 911 that was routed to the wrong county, and 20 years later, a death warrant signed by the governor of Florida. This is the case of Denise Amber Lee. On the 17th of January 2008, a 21-year-old mother of 2 was taken from her home on Latour Avenue in Northport, Sarasota County. Denise Amber Lee's abduction was carried out by Michael Lee King, a plumber who investigators say was driving through the Northport area at the time. King took Lee from her home while her 2 young sons, ages approximately 2 years and 6 months, remained inside. During the abduction, Denise Lee was able to gain possession of King's cell phone. She used it to call 911, providing information to try to help responders locate her. At least 4 separate calls were made to 911 during the course of the abduction by different witnesses, including one from a driver who reported hearing calls for help near the Sarasota-Charlotte County line. That particular call was routed to Charlotte County rather than Sarasota County, a jurisdictional routing issue that meant responding officers were not immediately directed to the correct location. No officer reached Denise Lee in time. A Florida Highway Patrol trooper later stopped a 1994 green Chevrolet Camaro, matching a description provided by a witness. The vehicle belonged to Michael Lee King. Denise Amber Lee's body was recovered 2 days later, in a shallow grave near a canal in Northport. Investigators recovered physical evidence, including Lee's hair and personal belongings, from King's home and vehicle. DNA analysis positively matched evidence to King. Detective Chris Morales of the Northport Police Department was the investigator notified of the initial missing person report. The case proceeded to trial in Sarasota County, with Judge Dino Economou presiding. The legal case is documented as King v. State, Sarasota County Circuit Court Case Number 58, 2008, CF001087. King was indicted on the 6th of February 2008. A jury convicted him on all counts, including first-degree murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping, after deliberating for less than 2 hours. He was sentenced to death in September of 2009. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and sentence in a ruling cited as King v. State, 89 Southern Reporter 3rd Series 209, decided in 2012 under docket number SC092421. The United States Supreme Court subsequently declined to hear a further appeal. On the 13th of February 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed King's death warrant. The United States Supreme Court denied his final appeal on Monday, the 16th of March 2026. Michael Lee King, then 54 years old, was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison near Stark, and was pronounced dead at 6:13 in the evening on the 17th of March 2026, Florida's 4th execution of that year. This case produced significant, lasting legislative change. In direct response to the jurisdictional routing failure during the 911 calls, the Florida legislature passed the Denise Amber Lee Act, unanimously, improving statewide training and coordination standards for 911 dispatch operators. Denise's husband, Nathan Lee, went on to found the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, an organization focused on continued advocacy for emergency dispatch reform. This case stands as one of the clearest examples in this state's legal history of how a single procedural failure, a misrouted emergency call, can shape not only the outcome of an individual case, but statewide policy for years afterward. This is the case of Denise Amber Lee, a conviction secured, a sentence carried out 18 years later, and a legacy of dispatch reform that continues to protect callers across Florida today. Case 8, the investigation into Haleigh Cummings. A back door propped open with a cinder block, a 17-year-old babysitter with a shifting story, and a case that, more than 15 years later, remains one of Florida's only unsolved Amber Alerts. This is the case of Haleigh Cummings. Please note, this case involves a young child. We will state only the confirmed facts of the investigation and will not speculate about or describe what may have happened to her. Overnight between the 9th and 10th of February 2009, a 5-year-old girl disappeared from her family's mobile home on Green Lane, in the Hermit's Cove area of Satsuma, Putnam County. Haleigh Cummings had gone to bed around 8 o'clock that evening. Her father's live-in girlfriend at the time, 17-year-old Misty Crosland, told investigators she went to sleep in the same room around 10 o'clock, with Haleigh's younger brother also present in the home. Haleigh's father, Ronald Cummings, arrived home from work after 3 o'clock in the morning. According to the account given to investigators, Misty Crosland said she had just discovered that Haleigh was missing. The back door of the home was found ajar, with the screen door propped open using a cinder block. A call to 911 was placed at 3:37 that morning. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Jeff Hardy, opened an investigation, later joined by the FBI and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Captain Dominic Piscitello was assigned as lead detective as the case progressed. Search teams, including divers, searched the nearby St. Johns River as part of the investigation. Investigators publicly stated they did not believe Haleigh's disappearance was the result of a stranger abduction, citing inconsistencies in Misty Crosland's account of events on the night Haleigh disappeared. By April of 2010, Sheriff Hardy stated publicly that the case was being investigated as a homicide and that unspecified persons of interest had been identified. Crosland was described by the sheriff at that time as key to the case, though she was never charged in connection with Haleigh's disappearance. Separately, in January of 2010, Misty Crosland, Ronald Cummings, and several other individuals were arrested as part of an undercover prescription drug investigation. It is important to be precise here. Authorities stated these drug-related charges were unrelated to Haleigh's disappearance. Crosland was sentenced to 25 years on drug trafficking charges. Ronald Cummings and others involved received 15-year sentences on related charges. Cummings was released from custody in 2022. Crosland's sentence is set to run until 2031. Because no one has ever been formally charged in connection with Haleigh's actual disappearance, every individual named in this investigation, including Misty Crosland, is presumed under the law to have had no criminal responsibility for what happened to her, absent any conviction stating otherwise. Haleigh Cummings has never been found. Investigators consider her case one of a small number of long unsolved disappearances in Florida that originated with an activated Amber Alert, the emergency child abduction notification system used nationwide. Law enforcement continues to treat the case as an active homicide investigation, and it is presumed by investigators, though not confirmed, that Haleigh did not survive her disappearance. The case has drawn extended national media attention over the years, including coverage from major networks examining both the original disappearance and the subsequent, separate drug-related prosecutions of those connected to the household. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office continues to list Haleigh Cummings' case as open and continues to accept tips from the public regarding her whereabouts or regarding the circumstances of her disappearance. This is the case of Haleigh Cummings, more than 15 years since a 5-year-old vanished from her own bedroom, and a file that remains, to this day, unresolved. Case 9. Dale Smith Jr. A television courtroom dispute over an engagement ring aired the same day she vanished. Ground-penetrating radar searching a concrete slab more than a decade later. This is the case of Michelle Parker. On the 17th of November, 2011, a 33-year-old mother of 3 disappeared after dropping off her twin children at her ex-fiancé's condominium in the Orlando area. Michelle Parker's disappearance occurred on the same day that an episode of the television program The People's Court aired, featuring Michelle and her former fiancé, Dale Smith Jr., disputing ownership of a $5,000 engagement ring. During that broadcast, Michelle Parker had publicly stated that Smith had previously been abusive toward her. That afternoon, around 3:30, Michelle dropped her 3-year-old twins off at Smith's condominium. She never arrived for her scheduled bartending shift that evening. Her black Hummer was found abandoned the following day in a nearby parking lot. Investigators noted that decals from her airbrush tanning business had been removed from the vehicle. Approximately 3 weeks after her disappearance, dive teams recovered her cell phone from a lake near a bridge in the Belle Isle area. The Orlando Police Department, with Detective Mike Moreski assigned to the case and Sergeant Jim Young serving as a department spokesperson, publicly identified Dale Smith Jr. as the prime suspect in Michelle's disappearance. In 2013, investigators stated publicly that they believed the case involved two people, acknowledging evidence suggesting a second individual was involved in addition to Smith. A red light traffic camera captured Michelle's Hummer on the road at approximately 8:55 that evening, providing investigators with a partial timeline of the vehicle's movement after she was last seen. Public records show that Dale Smith Jr. had prior domestic battery convictions, including a felony battery charge from 1997, as well as a court-martial in the military justice system in 2001, that resulted in a dishonorable discharge in 2003. It must be stated clearly, despite being named the prime suspect, Dale Smith Jr. has never been charged in connection with Michelle Parker's disappearance. Under the law, he is presumed to have had no involvement unless proven otherwise in a court of law, and no such proceeding has occurred. In August of 2023, the Orlando Police Department used ground-penetrating radar technology to search property belonging to Smith's father, focusing specifically on an area beneath a concrete slab. This forensic technique allows investigators to identify subsurface disturbances without excavation. No evidence was found during that search. Michelle Parker's family has filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit against Dale Smith Jr., a separate legal track from any criminal prosecution, which operates under a different legal standard of proof. Michelle Parker has never been found. A reward of $200,000, offered by an anonymous donor following a 2022 television special examining the case, remains available for information leading to a resolution, in addition to a separate reward offered through Creamline. This reward is routed directly through the family and their designated tip line. This case illustrates the layered, long-term nature of many unsolved investigations. An initial criminal investigation that identifies a suspect but produces no charges, followed years later by both continued forensic search efforts, such as ground-penetrating radar surveys, and by parallel civil litigation seeking accountability through a different legal channel entirely. The Orlando Police Department continues to list Michelle Parker's case as an open, active investigation. This is the case of Michelle Parker, 14 years since her disappearance, a named suspect who has never been charged, and a case still being actively pursued using modern forensic search technology. Case 10, Stephen Williams. A husband with, in the words of investigators, gross inconsistencies in his story. A guilty plea made in exchange for the location of remains, and a natural preserve that would not have been searched without his cooperation. This is the case of Trisha Todd, one of two fully resolved cases in today's collection. On the night of the 26th of April, 2016, a 33-year-old hospice nurse and United States Air Force veteran was last seen on surveillance footage at a public supermarket in Hobe Sound, Martin County, purchasing gasoline around 1 o'clock in the morning. Trisha Todd was scheduled to pick up her 2-year-old daughter from her ex-husband, Stephen Williams, an active-duty airman stationed in North Carolina, on the 27th of April. She never arrived. She also failed to appear for her scheduled work shift that day. She was reported missing on the 27th of April, 2016. Investigators located her car near her home. Her keys remained in the ignition, and her purse was found inside the vehicle, but the car was out of gasoline, and her cell phone was missing. The Martin County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff William D. Snyder, led the investigation. Detectives traveled to North Carolina on multiple occasions to interview Stephen Williams. Investigators described his account of events as containing what they termed gross inconsistencies. Based on this pattern, Williams became the primary suspect in the case, and he ultimately confessed to investigators. On the 25th of May, 2016, Stephen Williams was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and child neglect. As part of a negotiated plea agreement, Williams agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 35-year prison sentence. Central to this agreement, Williams also agreed to lead investigators directly to the location of Trisha's remains, a critical element in these types of cases, where locating remains provides the family with confirmation and closure that an unresolved disappearance cannot offer. On the 26th and 27th of May, 2016, investigators, guided by Williams, recovered partial remains from a container buried approximately 3 feet deep within the Hungryland Slough Natural Area Preserve. A forensic anthropologist from Florida Gulf Coast University assisted directly in the recovery and identification process, using standard forensic anthropological methods to confirm the remains. Assistant State Attorney Brian Backadall, the prosecutor assigned to the case, noted publicly that because only partial remains had been recovered, there was some question about whether all terms of the plea agreement had been fully satisfied. Ultimately, the terms of the agreement were confirmed as met, and at the end of September 2016, Stephen Williams was formally sentenced to 35 years in prison. This case demonstrates a specific and important investigative principle. In cases where physical evidence of location is unavailable, plea negotiations can sometimes be structured to directly exchange a reduced or agreed-upon sentence for cooperation that leads to the recovery of a victim's remains. This approach prioritizes providing resolution and confirmation to surviving family members, alongside securing a conviction. Trisha Todd's daughter, 2 years old at the time of her mother's death, is being raised by extended family. The case has been featured in national documentary coverage, including an episode of ABC's 2020 news program. Stephen Williams remains incarcerated, serving his 35-year sentence for the second-degree murder conviction. This is the case of Trisha Todd, a case resolved through confession, forensic recovery, and a negotiated agreement that prioritized bringing a missing mother home to her family. That completes today's 10 cases from Hidden Case Diaries. 9 of these 10 cases remain open. 9 families are still waiting for an answer that, in most of these files, has not come in years, and in some, has not come in decades. If you have any information related to any of the open cases discussed today, please contact the law enforcement agency named in that specific case, or submit a tip through the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. If this channel's approach to these cases, factual, careful, and centered on the investigation rather than the tragedy, is something you value, like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to Hidden Case Diaries for our next case file.